I wasn't sure whether or not I wanted to make this video because I have been reading a ton of mystery novels lately. One of the reasons I haven't been doing a lot of book reviews is that, mystery novels kind of blend together. Like, what would I talk about really? Like, oh, it was really cool when the guy figured this out and this character was interesting. Like, it's one of those things where I'm kind of like, how exactly do I talk about this and make it interesting, right? Because all the books I've been reading, for the most part, have been absolute bangers, right? I've talked about Raymond Chandler, I've talked about like Richard B. Parker, I've talked about uh, a handful of other books, right? And going through this genre and uncovering more and more stuff, I have been experimenting more and more, right? I have, through the help of the greatest literary resource of all time, ChatGPT, have found a number of classics that are recommended to people who are fans of certain books. And I have like a whole lineup of them in my on my Kindle, right? You have like the Mike Hammer novel, awesome. You have Lou Archer, which I haven't touched, and then you have like the Postman always rings twice. And like looking at the book description and like how it was described to me, like I felt like I was expecting something completely different, and I suppose that was why I was so reluctant to read this, right? Going into it is that like I read the first 5% or so and found it really boring. And that's because like this isn't really a detective story, not like the other things that were recommended in that list, right? If anything, it's kind of like a Columbo episode, right? Where you're following the protagonist and his misadventures in trying to get some guy killed. Right? Right? You're essentially playing as the reading about the culprit, right? Playing as the culprit, right? You're essentially reading a story about the culprit, right? And why he did what he did, and how he went about it, and his methods and everything that goes wrong. It is a really interesting read because going through it, it's very brief. Going through this novel, going through this book, I wasn't sure how much I liked it. It wasn't until the halfway point that I really began to realize just like what the novel was trying to do. And going into the ending, I found myself like reasonably impressed with it. Right, the novel is really well paced. It has a handful of really good, memorable sequences and characters. Right, it has a really good payoff, but reading it is kind of a drag, right? And that's one of the reasons I'm kind of iffy on this book as a whole, because, on one hand, you have really, really good moments, right? It's not a very long book, but the moments that really work on it really shine, right? But then you have like the rest of it, which is just kind of building up to what the book is trying to do. The story it's trying to tell. And a lot of it is really, I hate calling it dry or boring because it's really not. It's not very super elaborate, right? It's very simplistic. And I think that's kind of the charm of it, is that it is so simple and it all comes together so beautifully. But at the same time, you're kind of just like, I am used to like these really elaborate plots, right? Like all these situations and all these different characters. This book has a really relatively small cast, right? In which the protagonist is a drifter who wanders into a restaurant one day and is hired by the guy working there, right? And the protagonist only sticks around because that guy's wife is hot as hell, apparently, according to him. And so what ends up happening is that the protagonist realizes the wife is miserable and they start sleeping together. And then they realize that if they're going to run away together, if they're going to have their life, they're going to have to kill the other guy. And so what ends up happening is that they try to commit murder, fail the first time, end up in this situation where they have to like uh, try to weasel their way out of it. it feels like it's not going to work. It feels like it couldn't possibly work. Like the protagonist is not as smart as he thinks he is, but it does work. And they do get off that time. And both of them, the man and woman, decide like that they can't do this anymore. Like it was a bad idea, blah blah blah, and they go their separate ways. And then by pure coincidence, the man meets up with the guy again, and they go out together again. And the woman is so rattled. She's so miserable in a relationship. She loves the protagonist so much that she decides, against her better judgment, that they have to try again. And so they do it again and have to go through the same court. They have to um, go through the same process, like going through the legal process, right? They meet some like aggressive judge. They interact with their own moral attorney, right? This guy who does not give a flip if they did it or not. He just wants to win. Like they through sheer luck, right? This contrived situation, right? They somehow make out like bandits, right? They make $10,000 off of successfully murdering this guy because of the insurance policy that he took out like a couple of days before. Off of some insane technicality, right? Their attorney manages to win the case in like a masterstroke. The play of his career. And so, like, they completely get away with everything, and they have to live with that fact. And it's really interesting to see this happen because they get away with murder, right? Completely get away with it. They're complete scot free, uh, and they're not happy, right? The thing about this is that they make out like bandits. They get everything they wanted, and yet neither of them are happy because they don't really trust each other, right? In the immediate aftermath of the murder, right? The guy cheats on her once. She finds out about it. They seriously accuse each other of like snitching, right? There's this huge just situation in which they eventually the situation just collapses, right? It's really really interesting, seeing all this play out. Like the character dynamics are really really well done. Where you have like the husband who's like really fond of the other guy and is completely unaware that like he's sleeping with his wife, right? You have the protagonist who is not as smart as he thinks he is, right? Who just puts this woman into this like incriminating situation, right? And she just goes along with it because she's so miserable, right? She has this breakdown, and then they get married, and then she immediately dies in a car accident, and then he gets convicted for her murder. It's so simple, right? It's so simplistic in some respects. It sounds like Goofy explaining it in some ways because it's so short and so simple, right? But at the same time, it just really, really, really works for what it is, right? Again, I'm a big critic of the idea that like longer novels are inherently better, and I think this one is a really good example of just how like a relatively simplistic idea can work really really well if it's executed properly. And I do think this is a really good example of just how everything in this novel just builds up to a relatively satisfactory conclusion. Now, is it one of my new favorites? I don't think so, right? Again, I found myself just not entertained reading this a lot of the time, right? Like once I saw where the plot was going, like I got into it, but at the same time, it's like, there is no denying that you do get frustrated with the characters. And that's kind of the point, that they aren't supposed to be good people. But at the same time, it's like, yeah, I don't know. It's difficult for me to like put into words like my mixed feelings on this one. I do think I came away like I've come away with like really good positive impressions on it, right? I do think that, but at the same time, we do need to have this conversation. Like, well, it feels like it's missing something in some ways. Like it's missing like the drama and just the heart of I think the stuff that I think is worse than this, but I enjoy more. Right? I talked a little bit of this when it comes to like those Richard B. Parker novels I read. Like I really, really liked both of them, right? The God Wolf manuscript and what is the second one called? Shit. The second one, right? What was it called? They all have really good titles, and I cannot remember them. But like, I read the second one, and I think to myself that like, yeah, this is kind of pandering, right? This kind of feels like it's a bit too fanciful. It feels a bit too ridiculous, right? The protagonist is sleeping with like all these hot babes, right? In the first one, he bangs the mom and then the daughter, right? It's all like just ridiculously like exaggerated detective stuff. But I really like that about it though. Like that's one of those things. It's just like it's so like pandering to its male audience that you kind of like appreciate it for that. And I don't know, like the Postman always brings twice feels kind of like real to me. It feels like a little bit too a little bit too involved in like the real world. It feels a little bit too grounded, right? It doesn't have any romance or feel or like some. It's weird. Like to me, I think the thing I really enjoy about the genre is just how much fun the stories and characters can be. And I just don't really think I had fun reading this novel, even though it is objectively good. And I suppose that makes me kind of a pleb when it comes to this kind of thing. I can't appreciate good noir fiction, but that's how I generally felt. I like felt like in spite of all the positives, I felt kind of mixed on this one.